The Lighthouse Keeper's Catastrophe by Rhonda and David Armitage. Mr. Grinling was a lighthouse keeper. He lived with Mrs. Grinling in a little white cottage on the cliffs. Every morning he rowed out to his lighthouse to clean and polish the light. Every morning Mrs. Grinling prepared a delicious lunch for him. At lunchtime, Mrs. Grinling packed the lunch in a basket and sent it down the wire to the lighthouse. On high days and holidays, when the sun shone, Mr. and Mrs. Grinling opened up the lighthouse, hung the key safely on its hook inside, and spent many contented hours fishing. Hamish the cat lazed about in the sun. From time to time, he roused himself to chase the seagulls. This particular morning, chasing seagulls was not what Hamish had in mind. He was much too busy enjoying himself in other ways. Mr. Grinling was not at all pleased when he saw what Hamish was doing. "Move it, pussycat!" he snarled, as he chased Hamish into the lighthouse. Slam! "That'll teach you to steal our fish, you little varmint!" And without thinking, he slammed the door shut. Mr. and Mrs. Grinling continued with their fishing. Soon, Mr. Grinling's stomach reminded him that it was lunch, and it would be very welcome. As he went to let Hamish out, he was struck by a terrible thought. The key? Where was the lighthouse key? Of course, it was inside. Mr. Grinling did his very best to get Hamish out of the lighthouse. He rattled the lock as hard as he could. He kicked and pushed and he cursed, but the door stayed firmly shut. "Don't worry," soothed Mrs. Grinling. "Hamish is quite safe where he is. We have the spare key in the old teapot on the mantelpiece in the kitchen." Gale warning, strong winds, thunder and lightning. The spare key was exactly where Mrs. Grinling said it would be, in the teapot. While she prepared cold chicken sandwiches, a fruit salad with lots of strawberries, and a chocolate milkshake for his lunch, Mr. Grinling was listening to the midday weather forecast. It was perfectly dreadful. Wind and rain with possible thunder and lightning later in the day. "I don't like the sound of that weather, Mrs. G," said Mr. Grinling. "The sooner I get back to the lighthouse, rescue Hamish, and switch on the light, the happier I shall be. If you could pack the lunch in the basket, I'll take it with me. Remind me to take a screwdriver, Mrs. G. I have some repair work to do." So Mr. Grinling set off down the deep, winding path with his lunch and the key in the lunch basket. It was not until he was halfway down the hill that he heard Mrs. Grinling calling from the little white cottage. "The screwdriver, Mr. G! You've forgotten the screwdriver!" "Botheration!" he muttered. Climbing cliff paths for a plump lighthouse keeper was rather hard work. He put the lunch basket on the bank and stumped back towards the house. Oh, what a silly man. He really ought to have known better. Already the seagulls were beginning to gather, and as he turned the corner, down they swooped. Such greedy creatures! They squabbled and flapped and squawked and tugged, trying to get to the lunch. Finally, the basket started to move. Down the slope it went, tumbling, bumping, faster and faster and over and over and over until it came to the cliff edge. For a moment, it almost seemed to stop, and then it was gone. And so was the key. Down it drifted, down past the eagle ray and the angelfish, all the way to the seabed. There it lay amongst the rocks and the seaweed, where only the octopus, the crab, and other sea creatures would ever find it again. Mr. Grinling was very puzzled upon his return. It was not until Mrs. Grinling came to help him search that she found the bits of cold chicken and the odd strawberry. But no lighthouse key. Not on the slope, not anywhere.
"Oh, you are a foolish man, Mr. G. All your life you've lived among seagulls, and you still leave your lunch out for them to eat."
Mr. Grinling smiled rather foolishly. "I'm sure we have a third key somewhere." Mrs. Grinling shook her head.
"I don't think so," she said. "Don't you remember one dropped through that hole in your trousers last year?"
Already the sky was beginning to fill with clouds. "Well, there's nothing for it, Mrs. G. I'll just have to climb in." So they collected the ladder and rowed back to the lighthouse. While Mrs. Grinling held the ladder, Mr. Grinling climbed very slowly to the top.
"I don't like this, Mr. G,"
she called. "You know I get dizzy when I climb up high."
"Don't look down," she replied. "Think of Hamish. Think of the light. Think of all those poor ships that might get wrecked unless that light shines tonight."
But in the end, it was not dizziness that stopped Mr. Grinling. Oh, dearie me, no. It was all those scrumptious lunches he had eaten. In through the window he climbed, and there he stuck fast. Neither backwards nor forwards could he go. He was just too fat. Nor could Mrs. Grinling help him. She pushed and she pulled and pulled and pushed until he squealed, but she couldn't get him to move.
"I'm sorry, Mr. G," she said. "There's only one thing that can be done. I'll have to remove those great heavy trousers."
Off came the boots, and off came the trousers. Mr. Grinling wriggled again, and at last he was free. Rowing home was difficult for Mr. and Mrs. Grinling. The wind was almost gale force by now, and the waves kept breaking over the bow of their little boat. "There must be another key somewhere," said Mr. Grinling. "We'll just have to search until we find it." And search they did. They opened old tins and jars, they emptied out drawers, and they peered into cupboards, but to no avail. No key labelled Lighthouse could be found. Cottage door keys for the front, old key from a wrecked ship, cottage key for the back, red suitcase key, tool shed key, weather station key, first aid box key, blue suitcase key. "I'll just have to cycle into the village and alert the Coast Guards," said Mr. Grinling.
"No time," said Mrs. Grinling. "Look at that sky. You'll never get there before dark, and you haven't got a light on your bike. But I've got an idea, a perfectly brilliant idea."
Potatoes? Flour? While Mr. Grinling looked on, Mrs. Grinling rushed about the little white cottage, gathering up all manner of things. She put everything she had collected into a large sack. She weighed the sack, and then she weighed Mr. Grinling. Mr. Grinling began to feel nervous, but he wasn't quite sure why. By the time Mrs. Grinling had attached the sack to the pulley and sent it down the wire, Mr. Grinling was biting his fingernails and muttering to himself. Mrs. Grinling smiled happily.
That worked perfectly, she said. Your turn now.
Mr. Grinling's legs became quite wobbly, and he had to sit down quickly in the chair. "Me?" he squeaked. "On that wire? All the way to the lighthouse? You know I'm terrified of thunder and lightning, Mrs. Grinling. How could you suggest such an idea on a night like this?" Mrs. Grinling spoke to him in a stern voice.
You must be brave, Mr. Grinling. Think of your poor little Hamish all alone in the dark. Think of all the ships that might be lost because your light isn't shining.
Mr. Grinling shuddered. "Of course, you're quite right, Mrs. Grinling. I must be brave. I am the lighthouse keeper, and come rain or shine, I must tend that light." Without further ado, Mr. Grinling climbed into his wet weather gear, fastened the harness around himself, and attached it to the pulley. A quick glance back at his comfortable armchair, a big kiss of luck from Mrs. Grinling, and out he swung into the dark, wet night. Mrs. Grinling watched until Mr. Grinling became a tiny speck in the darkness. The minutes ticked by and nothing happened. Mrs. Grinling became quite agitated. Why was it taking so long? Had something happened to Mr. Grinling? At last she was able to uncross her fingers and smile again. Her plan had worked. Mr. Grinling and Hamish were safe, for there it was for all the ships to see, the light shining steadily and bravely across the ocean. The end.